The sun was dipping low over the Oklahoma highway when Malcolm Brooks pulled into the dusty rest stop. He had been driving for hours, suit jacket tossed in the back seat, tie loosened around his neck. All he wanted was a bottle of water and a stretch before the final leg of his trip. But the moment he stepped out of his car, the air shifted. Two local patrol cars were already there. The officers leaned against their hoods, sipping coffee and chatting until they saw him. A tall black man alone in a polished car, dressed a little too sharply for their liking. "Evening, sir," one called out, his tone edged with suspicion instead of welcome. Malcolm nodded politely, kept his hands visible. "Just stopping for a few minutes. License and registration," the other officer demanded, already moving toward him. Malcolm blinked. "I'm not driving. I'm parked. Am I being detained?" That was all it took. Within minutes, they had him face down on the concrete, cuffed too tightly, his ID tossed to the ground like trash. One officer whispered something crude about big city types, while the other accused him of acting nervous, as if that was a crime. They ran his plates twice. They searched his car without consent. They called him back up. Nothing came up. No warrants, no drugs. Just a law-abiding man humiliated in public. "You can go," they finally said, tossing his keys back at him like a dog. Malcolm didn't argue. He just drove off, hands trembling, jaw locked, blood pounding in his ears. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that Malcolm wasn't just anybody. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a suspect. He was a federal judge. And tomorrow morning, by sheer twist of fate, those same officers would walk into his courtroom charged with misconduct and racial profiling in another case. A hearing they thought would be routine, until they saw who was sitting behind the bench. The courtroom buzzed quietly as people filtered in the next morning. The two officers, Deputy Carl Turner and Officer Jake Mills, adjusted their uniforms and sat stiffly at the defendant's table. Neither of them looked nervous. To them, it was just another procedural hiccup, a slap on the wrist, maybe some sensitivity training, and back to business as usual. Their attorney whispered something about the judge being a new appointment from the circuit court. "Real by the book type," he muttered. "Shouldn't be too hard." But when the bailiff stood and called, "All rise," both officers turned and froze. There he was. Judge Malcolm Brooks entered, his black robe flowing, his expression calm but unreadable. His eyes locked briefly with theirs. Recognition flashed. They shifted in their seats, suddenly sweating under the fluorescent lights. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Brooks adjusted his glasses and looked down at the case file. "This court will now hear case number 17-454, State of Oklahoma versus Turner and Mills, regarding charges of racial profiling, unlawful detainment, and misuse of authority." The officers stared at him like they were seeing a ghost. Brooks didn't mention the night before. Not yet. He let the facts speak first. The prosecution laid out a damning pattern of stops and arrests, disproportionately targeting black drivers on rural highways. Dash cam footage, complaint records, testimony from other victims. The evidence piled high. Turner looked pale. Mills kept clenching and unclenching his jaw. Their lawyer asked for leniency, blaming training gaps and split-second decisions. Judge Brooks remained calm, professional. But as he reviewed the statements, the irony twisted deeper in his chest. They had no idea who they'd tried to humiliate. No clue that the man they had handcuffed like a criminal was now the one deciding their future. And still, he held back. But when he called for a recess, he looked straight at them and said quietly, "Officers, we'll resume in 30 minutes. Try to remember where you saw me last." Their faces dropped. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it should. Officer Mills paced back and forth, his boots clicking on the tile. Turner leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face twisted with disbelief. "Did you see his face?" Mills hissed. "That's him. That's the guy from the rest stop." Turner swallowed hard. "No way. That can't be. A judge? We would have known." But they didn't know. They hadn't cared. To them, he was just another black man alone in a nice car, and that had been enough. Inside his chambers, Judge Brooks sat quietly, staring out the window at the courthouse lawn. He'd spent years working for this. Law school, internships, clerkships, climbing every rung the hard way, always twice as hard, twice as careful, always calm, always composed. Yesterday had tested that. He thought about how his hands had trembled as he drove away, how the cuffs had left red lines on his wrists. He could still hear the gravelly voice in his ear. You people think you're above the law. No, not above the law, just tired of being crushed beneath it. When the recess ended, everyone filed back into the courtroom. The officers sat straighter now, but their confidence had vanished. Something about the way Judge Brooks looked at them, calm but unblinking, kept their nerves on edge. I'd like to speak before we proceed, Brooks said, his voice steady. He stood from the bench. Yesterday, he began, I was unlawfully stopped and detained by 2 officers. I was not speeding. I broke no laws. Yet I was cuffed, searched, and humiliated at a rest stop in broad daylight. A hush swept over the courtroom. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. Judge Brooks continued, I did not file a complaint. I didn't even speak of it until now. Because today those same officers sit before me. Mills buried his face in his hands. Turner's mouth hung open. I will not let personal bias influence this court, Brooks said, but I will let the truth be seen, not just through testimony but through experience. Mine included. The silence was deafening. Justice, it seemed, was no longer blind. The courtroom felt heavier now, not because of noise but because of truth. Real, undeniable truth that had walked in wearing a robe and a scar on his wrist. Judge Brooks returned to his seat slowly, composed as ever. But the room saw him differently now, not just as a judge, but as a man who had lived the very injustice on trial. The prosecution gave no final arguments. They didn't need to. The facts, and now, the faces spoke louder than words. When the verdict was read, it wasn't dramatic, just honest. Guilty, the jury foreman said. Twice, once for Officer Mills, once for Deputy Turner. The officers didn't move. They just sat there, stunned, stripped of the shield they thought protected them from consequences. Judge Brooks nodded solemnly. Sentencing will be scheduled within the next 30 days. Until then, both officers are to be suspended without pay. Court is adjourned. The gavel dropped. Everyone rose, but it wasn't over. As the room emptied, a young black man, maybe 22, approached the bench hesitantly. He'd been watching from the back, quiet, unsure. Sir, he said softly. Judge Brooks? Brooks looked up, surprised by the voice. I just wanted to say, thank you. I didn't know people like you were up there. I didn't think we stood a chance. Brooks smiled just faintly. We stand a chance when we stop letting silence protect the powerful. The young man nodded, his eyes shining. I'm going to law school next fall. Good, Brooks said. We need more of us. As the courthouse emptied and the press waited outside, Malcolm stepped into the sunlight. No handcuffs, no fear. The very road that had once tried to break him had led him here. Justice had looked him in the eye, tried to shame him, and failed. And now it bowed to him instead. For the first time in a long time, Malcolm Brooks felt the weight begin to lift. Not just from his shoulders, but from the shoulders of everyone who had ever been stopped, silenced, or ignored. Not today. Today, the system finally had to listen.